Good morning. Welcome. Thanks so much to each of you for being with us this morning. Really excited to have you tuning in for the 8th segment in our new series of regular Friday morning gatherings as we highlight innovative education leaders and cutting edge education ideas all across the state and really across the country. Despite many of the challenges that families, students, educators are facing during the pandemic, we've been really impressed by how K-12 education and post-secondary education leaders are responding, how they're remaining firmly focused on creating greater opportunity and doing both of those things both now and in the spirit of SCORE's commitment and our mission that we seek to catalyze innovative change in education. And in our core values as an organization, that many of the most difficult challenges in education can be solved through creative and innovative solutions. We want to highlight innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders from across our state who are lead players. So our goal each week or each month is to pick a single topic, a single cutting edge idea, and do a deep dive to quickly learn more, to hear from leading entrepreneurs and innovators, and hopefully to trigger some thoughts or ideas that you can take away and apply in your own daily work. I know how busy everyone is, so our plan is to keep these sessions brief and informal, although we would ask that as we go through the conversation to feel free to share any questions that you have in the chat box, and we'll be sure to get to as many as we can. So this morning, I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Jason Grissom and Erin O'Hara from Vanderbilt University and the Tennessee Education Research Alliance to discuss their research on school leadership and how effective school principals can be so important to school, teacher, and student success. So I'll quickly introduce Erin and Jason, and then we'll get right to the conversation. Erin O'Hara is the Executive Director of the Tennessee Education Research Alliance, part of Peabody College and Vanderbilt University. And Erin sets the strategic direction for the research partnership and guides the work in creating timely, high quality, and practice-focused research that we can all learn from and use in our own work. As part of her work, she also serves as a strategy and policy consultant for state leaders, school districts, and nonprofits. Prior to joining Vanderbilt, Erin created and led the Division of Data and Research as an Assistant Commissioner at the Tennessee Department of Education and managed the department's work in accountability, assessment, data quality. Dr. Jason Grissom is Professor of Public Policy and Education at Peabody College and Vanderbilt University and serves as Director of Faculty for the Tennessee Education Research Alliance. He oversees TERA's research agenda, helps set its strategic priorities, and collaborates with the Tennessee Department of Education, researchers at Vanderbilt and other universities, and other stakeholders to ensure that Tennessee has the research it needs for effective K-12 education policy decisions. And one of Jason's primary areas of research is school leadership. We're really excited to have both Jason and Erin joining us today. So please join me in welcoming Jason and Erin, and I'll turn it maybe over to you, Erin, first to get us started, to share an overview of the work, and then Jason. So thanks again for being with us. I'll turn it over to y'all.
Thanks, David, and we're really excited to be here this morning. I'll just talk for a minute about TERA and what we do. More than anything here, I'm going to serve as Jason's hype woman. He is really the star of the show and this work on effective principals and knowing more about both who are the most effective principals in Tennessee right now and how do we identify them. And also here, we're really thinking as well about the future. And how do I identify the characteristics of effective principals so that 5-10 years from now, we can, in the state of Tennessee, with all of the data that we have available to us, know more about who might be effective in their role going forward. And that's one of the things we're very excited about for the future. So what is the Tennessee Education Research Alliance? We are what is termed a research practice partnership. And so primarily we partner with the state, the State Department of Education. We have an advisory council that includes SCORE, the State Board of Education, the Tennessee Educators Association, so the TEA, TOS, the Organization of School Superintendents, the School Boards Association, the Educators of Color Alliance, and Ed Trust Tennessee. So we have a broad group that we work with that informs our work. And we primarily look to do work that is going to inform practice and policy right now, what are the things that leaders in Tennessee are most interested in knowing about, and how can we help them as they're making decisions about the next steps in policy and in practice? And so we do this work statewide, but we also have done work with school districts. And the work that we're going to talk about today is really one of our signature initiatives. We have had a focus on school leadership for a number of years. And again, that is really Dr. Grissom's bread and butter, and really the thing that he knows the most about. So he is really a leading scholar both in Tennessee and nationally. And so we're really lucky to have him here and have him lead this work in Tennessee and the work of the Tennessee Education Research Alliance. And so with that, I will hand it over to Jason.
Thanks, Erin. I'm going to talk pretty quickly about some of the work that we have done on school leadership, and then a little bit about a project that we're just starting that we're pretty excited about that builds on some of the work we've done in the past. So I'm going to start with this question of what we know about effective leaders, and we know a lot. And the big thing that we know is that how effective the principal is really important for the school. And so this is what you're seeing on the screen is this is a screenshot of the cover page of a report that I helped write for the Wallace Foundation, which is a foundation that does a lot of work in school leadership nationally. And they commissioned us to do this big synthesis of the last 2 decades of work on school leadership to see what have we learned about the connection between school principals and student and school outcomes. And you can actually find that report at wallacefoundation.org/principal synthesis. And the top line result, top line finding from that report is that when we look across the best available studies that are attempting to measure what's the impact of principals on student achievement, the looking across those studies and synthesizing, we basically find that the effect of replacing a below average principal, if you took a principal at the 25th percentile and you replace them with a principal who's above average, so one at the 75th percentile, and that could be an actual replacement, or it could be figuring out how to train the below average principal to move their performance to the level of the 75th percentile principal. But if you did that, that'd be worth nearly 3 additional months of learning for the average student in the school. And so the effects are really big, and it's every student in the school. So the effects are sort of unbelievably large of principal effectiveness. And so we conclude in the report that it's difficult to envision an investment with a higher ceiling on its potential return than a successful effort to improve principal leadership. I think we haven't thought enough about how important school principals are and what we need to do to move the needle. And so part of the work we're trying to do at TERA is figure out how to move the needle on school leadership. Like how can research be informative? And in fact, we've done a bunch of this work in Tennessee, Tennessee is a great place to study school leadership, actually, for a reason I'll tell you in just a second. But the work that we've done here using Tennessee data shows that leadership impacts, they're big for test scores here. Actually, our results using Tennessee data actually find that the effects of having a high quality leader are actually slightly bigger than that national average that I just showed you. But we also find that principal effectiveness correlates with all these other things. Like kids come to school more often when they're in a building with an effective principal. They have lower chronic absenteeism. The teachers report more positive school climate. Teachers say they're more satisfied, and that higher satisfaction tends to translate into lower turnover, particularly among effective teachers. Interestingly, it also translates into higher turnover among ineffective teachers. That's a phenomenon we call strategic retention, right? So this sense that high-performing principals are targeting the teachers who really need to be in the building and trying to keep them, and maybe not keeping teachers who aren't a good fit for the building. So we know a lot, and we're learning a lot about effective leadership in Tennessee. But then there's this question, well, how do we know who the effective principals are? And this is where Tennessee has this big advantage over almost every other state in the country. And that's because we have invested really heavily in this evaluation system, this multiple measures evaluation system for leaders since the 11-12 school year. And that evaluation system has multiple parts, but in particular, it has what we refer to as practice ratings. So half of a principal's evaluation comes from a rating of their practices that's rubric based. It's a rubric that's pegged to the Tennessee Instructional Leadership Standards. And so they are rated at least once, hopefully twice or more per year. And when we look at the practice ratings that principals are given, what we've found is that they are pretty good shorthand for how effective those principals are. And they should be, right? Because if the supervisor is doing a good job of saying this is what high quality leadership practice looks like according to that rubric, then it should be telling us who's effective. And so we've done a bunch of validation exercises with those team practice ratings, and we find that they predict a lot of things we care about. So for one thing, we run the Tennessee Educator Survey at TERA in partnership with TUE. And one of the things that we find is where supervisors are giving more positive assessments of leadership practice at a school, the teachers are also telling us that, that the leadership quality is higher in the school. And then we see that those practice ratings predict teacher retention, they predict student achievement growth and so forth. So that tells us that these practice ratings are picking up something about leadership effectiveness that matters. And that's a really big deal. It's a big deal for policy, but in my world, it's a really big deal for research, because what it means is that we now have this metric in hand that differentiates more effective leaders from less effective ones. We have that statewide, both from team and from the other systems that are used to rate principals, Coach and Tiger and so forth. And so that means that we can then use that measure to look for predictors of effectiveness. So the main drawback of that measure is that it's a coarse one. So it tells us who's effective. It gives us it differentiates effectiveness, but it doesn't tell us how people think, and it doesn't tell us exactly what they're doing to be successful. And those are things you really need to know if you're going to make training and selection decisions. And so that's the direction that we're trying to move, right? So what do we need to know more about? Well, what we need to know more about are what skills, capacities, and experiences that people bring to school leadership. What are they bringing to the principal's office that are most important for being effective? Because those are the things that we want then to identify in prospective leaders or to train for among prospective leaders. And so at TERA, our whole reason for being is evidence. And so can we bring solid empirical evidence to bear on that question of capacities and experiences and how they connect to effectiveness, and particularly we care about future effectiveness because we're really thinking prospectively about like tools that districts could use to identify people. And so if we could use the data that we have or bring in new and link those to new data, we could potentially identify factors that would that would be correlated with future effectiveness. And that would allow us to provide some guidance to districts, build some tools that are usable, affordable, and so forth, that would again help us affect leadership practice on the ground. And so when you're thinking about, well, what are those competencies? We're not starting from scratch. The other big piece of our Wallace report was pulling together the evidence on, well, what do effective leaders do using national studies on a national scale. And that report identifies these things that are in the middle of the screen here that are leadership behaviors, these 4 broad categories of behaviors that seem to be most predictive of school outcomes. So these are engaging in instructionally focused interactions with teachers. So that's data use, evaluation, feedback, and so forth. Building a productive school climate, facilitating collaboration and professional learning community among teachers, and then managing personnel and resources strategically. So when we're starting to look for competencies here in Tennessee, this will be our starting point, because this is what evidence from other states suggests is important. So the last thing I want to say is this: how are we going to get there? So we're doing work with data that we have, but the big thing that we're moving into now is collecting new data. So we're starting this 5-year project that's going to have 3 steps. I'll tell you what the 3 steps are, and then I'll stop. So the first is that we're going to be working with Tennessee school leaders and other partners to identify aspiring leaders. All right. So we're looking for people who are not yet principals, but are on the path to becoming a school principal. So these are people who are licensed, but they're not yet in principal roles. So we're going to identify those folks. And then we're going to do some work to assess their leadership capacities. All right. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can do this, and we're investigating. There's going to be multiple kinds of assessments that we're going to be both borrowing because they exist in the education world, or they exist outside of education. So we can draw on other sectors, business world, nonprofit, and so forth. We can also design our own assessments, right? Because these leadership behaviors that I was just arguing are our starting point. They're not great measures existing in the field of these things. So as part of what we'll be doing at TERA is helping to build those assessments. And then we're going to, once we have collected that information over this 5-year period, we're going to use the data that we have to test which capacities measured by those assessments best predict leadership effectiveness once people move into principal roles. And because we'll be identifying things that you collect pre-service and using it to predict what a person, how effective a person is when they move into the job in the future, that should be really useful in helping us identify competencies that we should be selecting on or training for, because we'll have shown that they have this predictive validity or this predictive power. And so we'll be doing that. We'll be doing it in different kinds of schools and different kinds of contexts across the state. We're really interested in this not going to be an urban project or a rural project, like really getting getting a full sense of the swath of needs across the state. So we're really excited about that. And just starting the process now of finding districts to partner with. So I'll stop there so we can chat more about school leadership and the work and why it matters.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jason and Erin. Really appreciate it. So I want to go back to the data point, Jason, that you mentioned as part of the Wallace study around the impact of more effective principal on student learning. Could you just talk about that data point a little bit more? I mean, that's so incredible that a more effective principal would have what 3 month impact of additional 3 months of learning on students. I just would love to hear more about that data point, because I find that so powerful, because we think about where we're spending our time and money and focus and improving outcomes for students. That just, I don't know, it gives us so much sort of insight around what's important.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty startling number, and it's actually much bigger than the number we thought we would find when we set about pulling these. So let me start with where that number comes from. So what we did in the synthesis, we pulled 5,000 studies is what we started with, and we went through this long process of whittling them down because we were trying to really land on the evidence that was sort of the best available. And so for making this kind of claim about the impact of principal effectiveness on kids' outcomes, it's actually really hard to do methodologically, because you need to be able to separate the impact of the principal from all the other things that are happening at the school. And you can do that. You can't do it. You can never do it perfectly. But there are studies that are using what we were looking for, the studies that were using the best available methodological tools for separating what's happening, what the principal's doing from, like the impact of the school community. And so these longitudinal designs in large school districts typically, or in full states, that are able to do that. And then you look, essentially what you're doing is you're looking at what principals are doing. You're looking at principals leading different schools, and you're also looking at schools being led by different principals, and you're combining them to tease out the impacts of individual principals. And there's a whole long story about how you do that. But essentially, we look, then there are studies in these different states, and we average them essentially. And you get this large impact when you look across the studies. And so then so one question is, well, how does this compare to the impact of a teacher? And I get asked that a lot. So the impact of a teacher is bigger. So the studies that sort of do that exact same exercise, but for teachers, they find that the impact of moving from the 25th to the 75th percentile of the teaching effectiveness distribution is worth about 4 months of learning. And so it's bigger, and that's what you would expect, right? Teachers are closer to kids and in the building, and they have direct interaction day to day. And so I think that's what you would expect. But what's important about principals is that even though their effect on the average kid is smaller, the effect of the principal is spread over the whole building. So the impact of the teacher is on the kids in his or her classroom. The impacts of the principal is over every child in the building. And so that the scope is large, even if the individual effect is smaller. Now, does that mean, we should be investing more in principals than in teachers? And the answer is no, because the way that principals are having the impact on kids is largely through what's happening with teachers. So it's not exactly an apples to apples comparison, because the way that a principal probably is impacting what's happening in a classroom is they hire good teachers, they hold on to good teachers, they create environments where teachers can teach. The way I think about this then is we should be investing in teachers. But one of the ways you can invest in teachers is by investing in having a building leader that can create the conditions for the teacher to do the job. And I think that's, the other evidence that we present suggests that's really the way to think about the channel there.
When you think about the research that you've both already done, and then also this new research that you're embarking on moving forward, are there any sort of, what are the implications you feel like that research has or could have for how we train, select, identify great school principals? Like, what are the real implications for how this research might impact the way we think about leadership development, or the ways that districts or the state is thinking about supporting great leaders?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So let's separate training from selection. So, I think one of the goals of our work in general, and how it links to pre-service preparation, is the hope that the work can give pre-service preparation providers greater insight into what principals need, like what are the capacities they actually need to be prepared for. And hopefully that can help maybe hone down offerings, think about offerings differently, think about how what needs to be taught in coursework, what needs to be taught in field experiences, how they need to be integrated. Because I think one of the challenges that prep programs face is they can't do everything, right? And so can the research help prioritize? Can it help focus on specific sets of needs and competencies that leaders in Tennessee need? So that's, I think, the broad goal on the prep side. On recruitment and selection, the goal is really, can we be of value to school districts? Because I think districts are, I think it's really challenging to know who's going to be effective in the future. That decision is so important, right? So staffing buildings with effective school principals is one of the, in my view, is one of the most important things that a school district can do to ensure school success. And yet you're operating at such an information deficit often when you're making a hiring decision. And that's especially the case in larger districts. Like, I think in smaller districts, it's maybe a little different, where you're tending to draw from an internal pool, and you get opportunities for the person making the hiring decision to observe a person up close. But as districts get larger, I think that gets harder. And so, can we help provide some direction both in, well, these are really the things you need to be selecting on, because there's an infinite set of things you could be looking for, but can sort of like with the prep discussion, like honing in on what you should be looking for, but also thinking about how. So, it's one thing to say, well, you should be looking for a person who's really great at being able to engage around instruction with teachers. But then how can you look for that? Like, can we give you a tool that can help assess what a person's potential is, what their capacities, their capabilities are on that dimension? And that's an ultimate goal of this work as well, is can we build out those tools to make it easier for school districts to be able to ferret out those competencies that seem to be so important.
In a practical sense, David, we did a project last year with Metro Nashville Public Schools and the Nashville Public Education Foundation, where we were looking at sort of what is the composition of principals in the district? How are principals placed? Are they our highest quality principals in the schools that need them the most? And really frequently the question was, well, how do we know who's going to be effective? And the answer is, as Jason just said, we don't totally know. But we think that there are ways we could know. And that's, I think, the thing that really excites me about this project, is that if we could, in 5 years, and hopefully even somewhat sooner, we'll have some things that we can share about this, but, give to districts and the state sort of a sense of, here are some things you could easily go and look for. And we're also really conscious about the fact that, the types of things that might be really informative from a research perspective might be really difficult for school districts to implement, or for the state to think about. And so we're going to be thinking about it in that capacity as well. And I mentioned our advisory council early on, and the folks that we work with, and that group of people. And David, you've been at a bunch of those kind of meetings we've had as well. Keep us honest about, like, what does this really look like in practice? And so I think I'm excited to think about what this looks like practicing, partnering with some school districts to actually think about how you then implement some of the things we hope to find here.
That's so helpful. I want to go back to the slide, and I don't know, Jason, if it makes sense, the potential indicators or sort of attributes that you're going to be measuring or looking at as a part of this next phase of research. And I wonder, just would be curious about any immediate or initial guesses or hypotheses you have about what the most important sort of indicators are of what will make an effective leader. What do you expect as you think about this next sort of phase of research, or what would you be surprised to see come out of this next phase of research?
Good question. Well, I have a little bit of a cheat because we have done some analysis. So I know some things. So for example, one of the things that we see sort of the existing data that we have, the best predictor of whether or not a person is going to be effective in their early years in the principal's office is whether they were a very effective assistant principal. And that makes a lot of sense, right? So when we look at practice ratings, for example, that were given to assistant principals by their principals, and we look at the people then who move into the principal's office, the people who are highly rated as assistant principals go on to be more successful as principals. And it makes a lot of sense. Similar job, right? And presumably, also that work you're doing as an AP is a good training ground for what you're going to do as a principal. Another thing that's related to that is another thing we see is that APs who work with more effective principals go on to be more effective principals themselves. And so that's also suggestive that the AP job can really be a training ground. Build up your skills as an AP and then move into the principal's office and you'll be more successful. Now, that doesn't tell you what the more successful skills are. And that's the thing that we're really trying to get at. So what do I think among those skills are likely to make the biggest difference? I think the evidence that we have suggests that I'll name two things. So one is work around instruction with teachers seems to be really important. And your capacity to be able to differentiate who is whether instruction is strong or weak, and give people feedback that can move their practice and connect them to other supports in the school. Like there's something in that domain that I think is really important and important for the current context that school leaders work in. But the other one that I think we ignore and we think very little about, I think to our detriment, is this like strategic management piece. I think we've made a big shift in the school principalship to trying to focus the school principalship on instruction, and that's an important shift. But in some ways, we've left behind thinking about running the school as an organization and having leaders think strategically, to have goals, which everybody has goals, but then think strategically about how to use the resources at hand to meet those goals. I think that's going to shake out to be pretty important because, every leader is operating in a resource constrained environment, but that doesn't just mean budget. That means also time and how you use personnel and how you assign teachers, how you hire and retain teachers. Like those are also resource constraints that represent resource constraints that principals face. And I think strategic thinking and skills around how to use resources strategically to meet goals, I anticipate that that's going to turn out to be pretty important.
If you think about it, the number, one of the things I think about and I've learned, I think a little bit from Jason's work too, is that the number of people alone that a principal is responsible for, direct supervision, right, is incredibly high in comparison to probably a lot of things in a lot of fields. And the number of moving parts and components, every school building is essentially like a small business in a lot of ways, right? They have customers in the building, they have customers outside the building, they have all of these different things that they have to think about. And so as critical as sort of to Jason's, just to sort of, again, reemphasize one of Jason's points, as critical as instruction is, these are actually just really, really hard jobs. And I think, as you think about it, that's really a critical piece of it as well. And so what's one of the reasons that I think as we get into this, we'll look into other fields a little bit more as well to sort of discover, what we can about how other complicated jobs also relate back to discovering more about, effectiveness for school leaders.
So I want to turn to a question that we got in the chat here, and really the question is around the fact that we know that there has been over the last few years an increase in teacher evaluation scores that in some ways doesn't necessarily reflect an increase in student success or student achievement all of the time, and wondering if there has been that sort of similar increase or similar trend in school leader scores, and if so, could that have an impact on sort of the predictive value of those kinds of evaluations?
Yeah, so you're right. So we've seen this shift upward in the scores that teachers have gotten over time. And we've seen a little bit of that with leaders. It hasn't been as extreme as with teachers. There's been a little bit of drift. But it's interesting. Like, one of the things we worry a lot about with ratings of anybody, but ratings of teachers in particular, is that they're not only drifting up, but also they're not it looks like there's not enough variation in them, right? When we look at sort of like variation in impacts on student test scores, for example. But leaders' ratings are more dispersed than teachers are. The mean is lower, and they're more dispersed. I don't know what that means, but there seems to be more variation in the ratings that leaders are given by their supervisors than in the ratings that principals and assistant principals are giving teachers. So that's again, I don't know what it means, but it is helpful to us from a research point of view, because I'm looking for sources of variation all the time. That's what I'm trying to explain, and so more variation is helpful. And you do worry a little bit. The drift creates a problem because you start to bump up against the ceiling, and then you do worry about predictive power. But that looks like it's not too much of a concern in the leader environment, at least at the current moment. Who knows about the future?
And then I want to turn to one other question from the chat, which I think is a really important question, and that's whether there are any differences, or whether you've seen any differences, or whether you anticipate any differences in this new research around the sort of attributes of effective school leaders in different settings. So what makes an effective school leader effective, or what are the attributes that might make them effective in a rural setting versus an urban setting? And I'm also thinking about perhaps in a school that is already higher performing versus a school that is lower performing, right? And do you anticipate seeing any substantial differences in characteristics of effective leaders in those different settings? Is that something you've seen in the past? Is that something that you're looking at in this new set of research?
Yeah, so I think this is a big, important, open question for the field in general and for Tennessee school leaders. I think we don't know very much here. I think we just don't have enough research, and so there's not enough research to really confidently differentiate with the existing research base, the differences between, say, rural and urban leaders, or even between elementary and high schools, or high and low performing schools, as you said. So this is like a big question for us, is whether there are differences across these domains. I think there's an opportunity to really learn something here. But I think, pick any of those domains, or any of those contextual characteristics, and you would expect that there would be differences, right? Running a high school is different from running an elementary school. And maybe it's the case that engagement with instruction, which I really argued was important, maybe that matters less, in a high school environment where you have a lot more teachers. The teachers are a lot more differentiated in terms of the content they're teaching. And so it's harder for principals to be able to, be giving feedback. I'm sort of making this up a little bit, but it makes sense, I think. And so maybe in a high school, this sort of strategic management really matters more. Like that you put the weight much more on strategic thinking and resource allocation in a high school. That's, I think, a reasonable hypothesis. I don't know if it's true or not. Similarly, you think about a difference between an urban and a rural school. The nature of relationships can be very different, right? One of the 4 domains I talked about was even two of them are really relationship based, because in the Wallace report, one of them is about building culture. One of them is about building productive collaborative relationships among teachers. And how you do that in an urban school might be very different in a rural school, where maybe the community is tighter knit. People are more likely to know one another. So that's one of the things rural principals tell me is, that the nature of their job is different because they're in a smaller community and they see their teachers at church and they run into them at CVS, and it's just the nature of the work is a little bit different as a result. So does that mean that the competencies required are different? Maybe. And I think we don't know. And so that's one of the things we'll be looking for as we push this work forward.
All right, last question that we've gotten from folks who are joining us, and then I'm going to turn to a couple final questions so that we'll be done in the next 10 minutes or so. But the upcoming research is over 5 years, and 5 years is a long time to wait, as somebody mentioned in the chat box here. And there are real needs, right, in terms of understanding this work now, and how we create the right kinds of supports and interventions to support the leader pipeline. Are there any? How are you thinking about sort of maybe sharing lessons learned along the way, or even sort of interim findings as you go through the work that could inform or impact the field, or sort of things that you're anticipating will be sort of key markers as you go through the research that don't require folks to wait 5 years for important insights?
Yeah, 5 years is a long time. And it seems infinite in the policy and practice world. In the research world, that's, barely a blip, because everything we do is slow. But the nature, the reason it's 5 years, and I didn't really get into the details of this, but because it's predictive, like one of the challenges that we have is when we're recruiting people and giving them assessments, we then have to wait for them to move into the principal's office. And so that's why it's so long. It's by necessity. We have to wait for time to pass to then be able to see the outcomes. Now that doesn't, what we are thinking though about, well, what can we learn along the way? And so we will be reporting out interim findings each year. And we're also thinking about, as part of this project, new and different ways we can use the data that we already have to provide some insights as well. And that doesn't need to wait 5 years. And so I really focused in on this assessment piece, but there are other aspects to the project as well that I think are going to allow us to be able to say more with what we have. And so, it won't be that people have to wait until 5 years, whatever that's, 2026 for us to make a pronouncement about all that we've learned. We're hoping that we'll be able to, there'll be sort of a steady drip of findings throughout the life of the project, and then that will pull it all together at the end. This is a great question. Like, school leadership is that important. We don't have time to wait to figure out what we need to do to intervene. And so we'll move as quickly as we can.
Can I make two quick other points here, David, which is there are things in what Jason shared earlier today. And if you want to go look at our website, there are some reports that we've already produced that are practitioner friendly, that are relevant and sort of based on Jason's research. And there are nuggets in there about things that people could be thinking about right now. For example, we do know that ratings that people get as APs, ratings that people get as teachers, training under a high quality principal, those things matter. And whether or not people are actually putting those into practice in schools and districts in their hiring processes is an open question for me, right? And so there are some things that probably can be done with some of the work right now. And I think we'd love to talk to folks about thinking about that. And we did some of that last year when we worked with the Nashville Public Education Foundation and MMPS about this. But the other thing is, for districts that are interested in participating in this project, and we are sort of starting to recruit districts now, and school leaders will be able to give information back over the course of time and the course of each year. So, so if people are interested, you can find us by Googling Tennessee Education Research Alliance. You can go to vu.edu/TERA, TERA, and you can find more information there as well.
Awesome. All right. Last question. We'll have to be quick on this one so we can get done in the next 5 minutes or so. But we've heard a lot about, particularly through the pandemic, we've heard a lot about challenges related to teacher retention. And I'm wondering to what extent the research you've done so far, the research that's upcoming, may look at that as a area of focus related to school leadership. What effect does the school leader have in making sure that teachers feel supported, and does that have an impact in retention?
Yeah, so great question. And we've looked at this relationship between leadership and retention in the past. We haven't yet looked at it in the context of more recent data in the pandemic years, and that's something that's on the docket because what we're seeing right now, it doesn't look like there has been this big exodus of teachers that people sort of expected as during COVID. That doesn't mean it isn't coming. I think a natural thing to suspect is that, places where there are more effective leaders and stronger climates and so forth, like teachers are going to be more likely to stick coming out of the pandemic. And that's something that we want to track. So that'll be on the docket coming up.
Great. All right. Last question. We ask everyone this question. Forecast ahead, look ahead, 20 years from now. What will look different in education? What will look different in how we prepare principals? You can think about this from a principal leadership perspective or anything else, just as you think broadly about sort of K-12 or higher education. What are you anticipating? What are you hoping for? What are you worried about as you think about sort of the way in which education looks 20 years from now? Jason, maybe I'll start with you and then we'll end with Erin.
All right. Well, I'll leave the leadership domain. I think the thing that we're going to see that's different is I think we're shifting towards a lot more personalization of kids' schooling experiences in education. I think part of that, I think we're learning a lot from COVID that's going to drive that. And so I think we're going to make this shift towards, really identifying kids' individual needs and goals, and then trying to ensure that, academic and other kinds of supports at the school are aligned with those individual needs. So I think 20 years, we're going to see a much bigger shift towards thinking about individualization and personalization of kids' trajectories through schools.
So actually mine's somewhat related. I was on a webinar yesterday with POSSIP, which is an organization I'm sure y'all are familiar with that gathers information from parents and teachers as well about how they're feeling about schools. And the topic was mental health. And I think that there's a conversation happening right now, in part because of the pandemic, in part because I think, nationally and even internationally, we're talking more about how the ways in which mental health actually affects our ability to be effective. And I think I'm hopeful that 20 years from now, one of the things that this period of time will have done is to shift a conversation to where we understand more and are doing more about how students, what students bring to school and also I think educators really can affect their ability to be effective and to learn. And so I'm hopeful that that's something that we've figured out more 20 years from now.
Awesome. All right. So we said we want to keep these to only 45 minutes or so. Want to respect everyone's busy day. Thank you so much, Erin and Jason, for being with us and for sharing the exciting work you're doing, the insights that you've seen. This is really, really important work, and I think just has a huge implication for the work that we're doing in education. So look forward to staying updated with what I know will be lots of exciting updates on this research and findings in the months and years ahead. Before we close, though, I want to also invite folks to join us for our next conversation. We will reconvene right after Thanksgiving at the same time, Friday, December 3rd, for our next conversation. And we'll be announcing our special guest for that conversation shortly. Look for the registration info soon over email, as well as a link for this morning's session and all of our past sessions on our SCORE YouTube page. Thanks so much again for joining us. Hope you have a great day, a great weekend, and a very happy Thanksgiving.